Hey guys, welcome to the Ramsey Paul Show. It is Friday, October 3rd. I'm doing a different type of show today. I'm not going over the top news items. Every once in a while, especially on Fridays, I'd like to dig deeper into a subject. And what got me started was observing the hysterics at the Copenhagen meeting where all the Europeans attended. They were in a tizzy about Russia. They in a panic that you could. There was a lot of anger, and many times anger is because of fear. And they were claiming that Russia must be defeated, that we are at war with Russia. And Orban said that the European leaders told him within 2 years we'll definitely be at war with Russia. I don't know how Europe plans to do that. Europe is very weak, but they have all these crazy plans. And they say things that Russia is weak, about to collapse, or losing all their battles. But at the same time, Russia is about to take over Europe. Total hysterics. And from an outsider, it doesn't really make a lot of sense because if you just look at it objectively, even if Russia should take over all of Ukraine, which I don't think Russia even wants to do, there are issues with the Donbass, which is primarily Russian people there, ethnicity. I'm not going to get into the whole history of Ukraine, but it just didn't happen out of nowhere where Putin wants to take over the world. So he decided to take Ukraine. Then after Ukraine, he's going to take Poland, then Germany, then France, then Britain. Then he's going to take over the United States. No, I don't think that's really going to happen. They always refer back to Hitler. Hitler wanted to take over the world, which was also a lie. He didn't. But they always reference that, right? Everyone's Hitler. Everyone wants to take over the world. Putin and the Russians, they had no legitimate reason for attacking Ukraine. It just happened in a void. He just woke up mad one day. And that is a stupid way of looking at it. There's a lot of complex issues. Obviously, Ukraine has been part of Russia for many years under the Soviet Union. They were part of the Soviet Union. It's had a very strange history over the years. So it's complex. And my goal isn't to get into all the complexities. It's just that it's a one off. Because Putin is in Ukraine doesn't mean he wants to take over the entire world. It kind of reminded me of people during the Vietnam era. Oh, if the North Vietnam wins, they're going to take over Thailand, and then they're going to take over Burma, and then they're going to take over Australia. It's going to spread. Well, the North Vietnamese communists won, and not much happened. In fact, they're sort of capitalists now. So the domino theory never happened. But these people, they don't see it like that. And I didn't really understand their emotion to it. It just seemed really strange. And this got me thinking about another event that really broke the original communists, a Marxist Leninist. And this was, I remember my lifetime, it was in 1983. I was 20 years old, 20 years old. So this is 42 years ago. Reagan invaded this small little island in the Caribbean called Grenada. And it was called, what was it called? Operation Urgent Fury. And so we sent in a bunch of Marines and because we were fearful it was like a communist dictator on the island or something like that. It's just a total irrelevant island. They're very poor, really no military significance. But we worried. We didn't want another communist island that was being supported by Cuba, who was supported by the Soviet Union. So Reagan sent in the Marines, and it really wasn't much of a battle. There's some Cuban construction workers, security forces, but within a week, the United States had conquered the whole island. And you would think at the time, well, big deal, just an irrelevant island, really a small island in the Caribbean. It's in geopolitical terms in the Cold War, it shouldn't have made a difference, but it really did. Throughout the communist world and the communist sympathizers, including the United States, because I was at university at this time in 83, and already at that time, universities were what you would call now woke or They were also Marxist Leninist. It just the way, and this is in Colorado. Even back in '83, it was that way, and it really shook the professors and it shook the communist world because this was not supposed to happen. Because based on their ideology, communism always marches forward, and they have this concept called historical materialism, which is it's inevitable that history always marches in one direction where you progress forward towards socialism and then communism, and it never goes backwards. In fact, it can't go backwards, but it did in Grenada. They ceased to be communist, and this shouldn't have been possible. And this really psychologically scared a lot of the Marxists, and they really had a meltdown with this. More than really made sense because, again, Grenada wasn't a part an island, but it was symbolic. And I thought of that when I thought of this current situation in Ukraine with all these European leaders like Starmer, Merz in Germany, Macron in France, and the girl boss, Ursula. It's, yeah, maybe Ukraine, eastern part of Ukraine being part of Russia, they may not like it, but it's not threatening all of Europe. But the way they're defining it, if Russia wins this, all of Europe, at least what Europe stands for, will implode. And I think they could be right in a way they don't maybe understand. It's very similar, I think, with again Grenada. Once Grenada fell, the whole communist structure became very brittle. People started to lose faith in the system. And then within 7 years, 6, 7 years, the whole Soviet Union fell apart. And I think we're seeing that process now with Ukraine, with what we would call progressivism. I used to call cultural Marxism. You've heard that term. Now we use the term woke, or for a while, social justice warriors. But there's that system has been in place for quite a long time. It has ruled the West for years, and now that system is starting to implode. And just like the Marxist Leninists couldn't imagine a country that was communist going back to capitalism, these woke people or cultural Marxists or progressives, whatever term you want to use, they couldn't imagine a country that has gone woke going backwards. This in their language, you hear it all the time. In fact, the term progressive implies that you start at a certain place and you progress forward. They never question, is that a good place to go to? They're just going forward. And anyone that's trying to stop that forward progression, they're reactionaries or they're conservatives, but the direction of humanity is in one way forward, which they define. And it's impossible to go backwards. And you hear people like Hillary Clinton and stuff, oh, we can't turn back the hands of time and have like a white Christian men running things. We can't do that. And you ask yourself, well, why not? Well, because the time and progress only marches one way. They think this is inevitable. It becomes part of their, more than ideology, it's almost becomes part of their theology. It's like a religion with these people. And to question that questions their whole religious outlook. And this is what's happening in Europe, because we had all these color revolutions in Europe trying to spread progressivism, wokeism. And the big one, obviously, was in Ukraine. In 2004, there was the Orange Revolution, and that was funded by Soros and a lot of other woke people. And what happened there is one of the person that won the election we didn't like, so we said the election was fraud. We were election deniers in this election. It was fraud. So there was a coup, and they put in a new president. And then there was another color revolution in Ukraine in 2014 when the president of Ukraine at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, he wanted to get closer with Russia, and he refused to sign a deal with the EU association. And because of that, then the West, based on Victoria Nuland, she admitted to this, and working with Soros, they launched a coup in Ukraine. And then we got another leader, then Zelensky. So this is how Ukraine has gone, because they looked at this. Okay, Ukraine used to be sort of in the Russia sphere which they have a different system. They're not part of our liberal democracy progressivism. And we got to get their old satellites like Ukraine, Romania, uh, Georgia, and we got to do whatever we can to get them within our global government type of sphere. And Ukraine was an important step in that. And now time is going backwards, it's falling apart. Again, it's like Grenada. It's like, well, what the hell's going on here? This shouldn't work this way. And it's Russia's now taking back Ukraine. So there's a lot of hysterics like, is the whole project of liberal democracy, progressivism, wokeism, cultural Marxism, is it starting to fall apart? So I think that's why we're seeing this panic now. It's a sign of weakness. And part of this, we have to kind of go back in history. One mistake a lot of American conservatives have made throughout my entire life, they have failed to understand that in the West, at least, we haven't faced just one enemy in communism. We called everything communism, like the John Birch Society, and we got to fight communism. And by that, they meant Marxist Leninist, which was mostly an economic model. And it was typified by the Soviet Union at the time. But you also had Cuba and some other states too, Vietnam, to a degree, China. So that's what we meant by communism. And that was a threat. There's no doubt about that. But there was another at the same time strain of communism that didn't even go by the term communism. Sometimes they did. It was what we call now, or what was called cultural Marxism. And there was a lot of difference between the two. Marxist Leninism was more about an economic model. How do you establish society fairly? Because the rich have all the money, and how we got to give it to the poor, all that type of stuff, and collectivism. Where cultural Marxism wasn't so much economic, it was about the culture and changing the culture that had been around for thousands of years, where you have the mother, the father, the family, Christianity, ethnicities, nations. And cultural Marxism was all about breaking that apart. So they came at it at two different ways, and they weren't the same thing. And a lot of conservatives, they fought the Soviet Union style of communism, and they did it fairly effective. I mean, like with Grenada, we overthrew that, and we ended up winning the Cold War against the Marxist Leninist. That is true. And in fact, that whole system only lasted about 70 years, which I'm going to get to, because there seems to be a pattern of 70-year cycles for these type of movements. So from about the foundation of the Soviet Union, if you want to call Marxist Leninism really been established until it fell in 89, 90, it was about 70 years. But at the same time, there was another competition called cultural Marxism, and it was founded in 1923 in Frankfurt, Germany. We get the Frankfurt School, and these were mostly Jewish people, Jews, and they had this theory of subverting society through sexual immorality, dividing, the sexes, trying to mass immigration. Even back in the 20s, they were writing about that and how that should happen to Germany. Get a lot of Africans into Germany to have sex with German women, and they started to push transgenderism. That's where it really started. It didn't start recently with Bruce Jenner. It actually had its roots back in Germany, in the Frankfurt School. And but that was kind of small, because at the same time in Germany, you also had the Marxist Leninists, the hammer and the sickle type people, and they were a lot more powerful. And then you have the nationalists, the Nazis, as we called them. But even the Nazis were somewhat influenced by in economic terms, by the communists. They were called the National Socialists for a reason. There was a lot of ties there between Nazism and Marxism. It's just a difference about, should it be national or international? And again, that's a very confusing topic there too. But those were the two big ones. So you had like the Marxist Leninist in Germany after World War I, had a lot of power following. And then you had the National Socialists under Adolf Hitler. and they fought it out. But then you had another group, and they were kind of a under the scenes, but they were at the Frankfurt Institute, and then they stayed there until Hitler got in power in 1933. Because you remember those photographs of the Nazis burning books, where they weren't burning the Bible or great works of literature. They were burning transgenderism type of degeneracy books. And that was a Frankfurt School. And so, anyway, a lot of the people at the Frankfurt School in the 1933, 1934, they saw, well, it's probably not going to be good for us to stay in Nazi Germany because, again, most of these people were Jewish, and we're not going to have a lot of luck here. And we thought we were, but yeah, Hitler put a stop to that. So most of them, they left Germany at the time, and they settled in New York City because, again, there's a lot of Jewish population in New York City. They had a lot of relatives there. And then they got tied to a university that was prestigious. I guess it still is, Columbia University. And Columbia University, they had their Institute for Social Research, they called it. So they set up this institute, and then within the year, they wormed their way into the Columbia University. And they were able to get a lot of power of that university, but they really had a plan of, okay, what we got to do in order to have our cultural Marxism take over instead of revolutionary Marxism is to gain control of the education system. We need the teachers so we can influence the kids. Sound familiar? We need to gain control of the media so we can put out our message, and definitely entertainment, movies and television. And they did a good job at that. They really did a good job of trying to take that over, especially after World War II. So they had in the universities, they had in the 30s and even the 40s, they didn't get into the popular culture so much. Then World War II was kind of a big pause on all this because obviously a big war going on. But then after the war, when we won the war and the National Socialists were defeated, this emboldened the cultural Marxists to go down their path. Starting in the 50s is when they really took off. It started with the universities. They spread out of Columbia universities into other universities like Berkeley and so forth. And this planted the seeds, for the 60s, the hippie movement and all that. And then they started to get a lot of people into movies and television, and they started to push their message. And this is how they went forward with it. And so at the time, this is what's really interesting. We had after World War II, we still have the Marxists and Leninists in like Soviet Union and China and other places. And then we had like the capitalist system, supposedly. But there's a third element that a lot of people didn't see, and it was the cultural Marxists. And they weren't necessarily tied to like Stalin or something like that. In fact, many of them hated Stalin. There was a complex relationship like between Israel and the Soviet Union. Initially, Stalin liked it, but then they had fights, and Stalin purged a lot of the Jews in the Soviet Union. So it was a very tense relationship. So the cultural Marxists within the country, they were kind of, because people were lazy, they assumed they were Marxist-Leninists, but they really weren't. They were kind of a separate breed of people. And they had a different goal because, again, the Marxist-Leninists, they were all about collectivism, power of the people economically, labor unions, that type of thing. And that was a big message. And a lot of European countries flirted with it. I think Greece had a big communist party. The Labour Party in Britain was, in some elements, pretty red. And again, so they were popular with blue collar type jobs, union jobs. I can remember that through the 70s, especially. But cultural Marxists, they were going at it a different way. They weren't so much about economics. They were more about mass migration. We need to eliminate nations because nations are dangerous to us. And if we mix everyone together, that will happen. And they saw white people as being the enemy. So you got the anti-white stuff. And this was their whole goal, that we got to break the sex roles, that men and women, they're really the same, and all the races are really the same. There's no racial differences. So they were really pushing this propaganda from the 1950s. And then we started to see it not just in the universities, It became popular with the teaching schools. So the teachers taught your children in high school and elementary school. Like they're so woke now, like all those people celebrating Charlie Kirk being killed. Well, because they were taught by the people out of the Frankfurt School that took over Columbia University, that spread their poison to other universities, especially teaching colleges. These teachers that were celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk, they're too stupid to understand that, but that's how they were programmed. And then it became within the media. I mean, you can see this if you lived through it. I saw it, how it went from the 60s to 70s to 80s, the pushing the feminism, pushing homosexuality, then later transgenderism, starting to push mass migration, push white people bad, push we need to, racism is the worst possible thing in the world. All races are the same. Sexism is bad. We got to think men and women are exactly the same. And all religions are even the same. So if you don't want to take a bunch of Muslims, then just Islamophobia, and then homophobia if you don't like sexual types of degeneracy. And these are all sins that have to be controlled by either censorship or actually arresting people like they do in Britain now. So this was the models that were going on. And I would say in the West, for the most part, and America was a leader after World War II. Sadly, it wasn't like us conservatives were in charge this whole time. That was an illusion. After World War II, in a sense, the conservatives, William F. Buckley Jr. and all that, Joe Sobran, Pat Buchanan, we were fighting a losing cause. We were the dissidents. The people in charge of the culture were very much cultural Marxist. And that's why if you go to Hollywood, they're all believe all this. They're all against racism, sexism, homophobia, you name it. Open borders are all for that. Everyone, almost everyone, maybe some underground, but this is the position. And the media is the same way. The journalists very what we would call left wing. But when we say left wing, I'm not talking Marxist Leninist, but this cultural sense of Marxism. And the teachers we've talked about to indoctrinate the children. So they've been, I would say the cultural Marxists have actually been in control of America since, I don't know, 1955 or so. It's been a long time. Now, it's been a somewhat slow process. It wasn't like in 1960, you had men dressing up as women, doing drag shows for your kindergarten children in public school. That wasn't happening in 1960, but the seeds were being pushed even back then. And it relatively, it went fairly fast. And the Republicans, or not the Republicans because they were losers, but the people on the right were always just trying to hold us all back. The people on the right in America, they were thinking of the times in America pre-World War II, but that America was gone. And the cultural Marxists, they had control of all the important cultural institutions. And that, so they've been in charge. And because the United States was the biggest power, we were able to influence Europe, especially Western Europe, not so much Eastern Europe. That's why you ever wonder why like Hungary is more conservative or even Poland than let's say France or England, because they, Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, they were part of the Eastern Bloc under the Soviet Union or influenced by the Soviet Union. So they kind of were spared a lot of this cultural Marxism or woke propaganda. Now, they were Marxist Leninists, but they didn't have the cultural Marxism. Stalin didn't put up with that. You couldn't be a man running around in a dress showing yourself to kids at a school. You couldn't do that in the Soviet Union. That started to happen in the West. And so the United States really influenced this ideology, and it went to Britain, went to France, went to Germany. And Germans were taught to hate themselves. They were taught a lot of lies about themselves. And it just went on. And this is the point we're now where Europe is extremely woke. And if you do anything that goes against a religion about race or sex or sexual degeneracy or religion, you will literally be arrested. They're in a weak position now. So this is the point we're at right now in history. And what's interesting is we're almost 70 years within this. So we had a 70-year period of Marxist Leninism that started in the early part of the 20th century, ended at 1989, 1990. That system collapsed. But then the system that was in the West, it wasn't good old fashioned Americanism from 1920 or 30 or the 19th century. It was this Frankfurt school that was really controlling most of our country. Not all. I mean, there's a lot of good people that resisted this. They still do, and they always did. But in the major culture institutions, they had total control. And so that is what's been controlling America, I would say, since around 1955 or so. You can debate the date, but now we're in 2025, so it's 70 years. And there's a theory which I think has some weight. It's called the Strauss-Howe generational model, that these movements, they have about a 70-year span. It is very similar to America. We've gone through this from the Revolution to the Civil War was one type of America. After the Civil War, it was a totally new America. It wasn't much like pre-Civil War. Then we had the Civil War basically to World War II, and again around 70 years. And now we've been this next 70 years in this what we would call now the woke model. Woke is a new term, but they would call themselves progressive, liberal democracy, what we would used to call cultural Marxist. So my point is that that movement is nearing the end just because of the time. There's a generational thing to this, and people are seeing it's starting to exhaust itself. Just like communism at the end, it started to become ridiculous, and only silly women believed in it. Men didn't really believe in it very much anymore. And we're seeing that now with this woke model or cultural Marxism. It's mostly silly women that are trying to defend all this stuff. And there's reasons for that. But it's tired and it's old and it's starting to break apart. And I think we're in a interesting point of history, an inflection period. And I think if Ukraine should fall to the Russians, that's going to fundamentally shake the psychology of the people in the West, thinking that their woke model, because you remember the whole idea of their vision of the future, I always said was a combination of two cultural icons. One was John Lennon's song Imagine. Remember, Imagine No Borders. We don't want any nations and we don't want any religion. And everyone just lives mixed up with each other, that type of thing. And then the other idea was Star Trek. You know, we'll just have all these people mingle together and strong women and homosexuals will lead it. But you have all these different religions of these people somehow that get along, even though they have wildly different ideas. That was the Star Trek vision of the future. And these people, they really bought that as the vision, that that's the way going forward. That's the way humanity's going forward. And they've been trying to put that in for quite a while. And they've been trying getting more frantic because it really hasn't happened, because it goes against nature, because there are differences in the races. It's just not social construct, it's biology. And there are differences between men and women. It's just not a social construct, it's biology. And religions have differences, sometimes profound, and they're not always compatible. You can't always put Islam in a country and be compatible with Christianity. It just doesn't work. And despite what Tony Blair may think, or Starmer, they may arrest anyone that says that, but it doesn't work. And so they've been trying to up this really quick here. And they had a couple of things recently they've done this. One was climate change. They were trying to use climate change as an emergency to try to get us all into a one world government type of thing. They're still working out that. And then when COVID came around, remember the Great Reset? We're going to change everything. They were really hoping to use that pandemic to alter the world in the West, one world government type of thing. And that fell apart. Remember the Great Reset? And now things are falling apart in Europe with Ukraine because Russia, they're not on that model of the woke model, and neither is China. So these people thought, well, it's just Russia and China are the last holdouts. Once we do our color revolutions, overthrow Putin, then we overthrow Xi in China, and then we'll have our John Lennon Star Trek future of global progressivism, wokeism, where we'll celebrate trans babies and all that shit. And they see now this is all starting to crumble. Their whole project of 70 years is starting to crumble. And I think it is. we're in a very difficult period. And when one time crumbles and another time comes in, it can be very bloody. It's very, there's a lot of turmoil. And we're seeing that with all these assassinations, all these hatreds, because a lot of people were held on to the old progressive system, which I think is falling apart now. And they always thought it couldn't fall apart. It was the future, just like the old Marxist Leninists thought their future was Marxist Leninism. They couldn't understand how that could fall apart. That was their whole world, but it fell apart. And we're seeing the global woke empire starting to crumble now. And I think we saw that a little bit in Europe, how they're in a panic, the girl boss and all these people running around. They don't know what to do. They're in a panic because if Ukraine falls, that means their whole project of trying to get the whole world under their control is not going to happen. We're not going to have this big, everyone just live together in racial harmony with no nations. And we're not going to have this, we can get rid of men and women. They're exactly the same. And all of that's crumbling. You can see that with the trans movement. It's all crumbling because people are saying this isn't reality. So I don't know if that's a white pill or black pill. Or black pill, we're in a difficult time. White pill, I think we're going to something better. Unfortunately, we've been in a 70-year period that's got worse and worse and worse, and we've got to this point. But I think we're going to make through this change, and it'll be better in the long run. So anyway, a little bit more of a history video today. Hope you guys all have a great weekend. Talk to you guys later.